Hi, everyone. My name is Cecelia Cancellaro, and I'm the senior editor for US and Latin American history here at Cambridge University Press. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this webinar today, where I will be in conversation with Adriana Chira and Elizabeth Hordge-Freeman, who've both published powerful new books this year as part of our Afro-Latin America book series, which is edited for us by Reed Andrews and Alejandro de la Fuente. I am really excited to introduce you to these two women. It's been so wonderful getting to work with them toward the publication of these two incredible books. Adriana Chira is an assistant professor of Atlantic World History at Emory University, with affiliations in Latin American and Caribbean studies and in African studies. Her work focuses on emancipation and post-emancipation era rural populations in the Spanish Caribbean. Her book, Patchwork Freedoms, Law, Slavery, and Race Beyond Cuba's Plantations, which we'll be talking about today, was published this year. Adriana is at work on a second book that explores land politics and land squatting in rural Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Spanish Equatorial Guinea during the first half of the 20th century. Elizabeth Hordge-Freeman is Associate Professor of Sociology, Interim Vice President of Institutional Equity, and Senior Advisor to the President and Provost for Diversity and Inclusion at the University of South Florida. Her first book, The Color of Love, Racial Features, Stigma, and Socialization in Black Brazilian Families, was published in 2015 by the University of Texas Press. It received the Best Book Award from the American Sociological Association's section on emotions, as well as the American Sociological Association's Body and Embodiment Best Publication Award. The book was also awarded the Society for the Study of Symbolic Interactionism Charles Horton Cooley Book Award. Dr. Hordge-Freeman is also the co-editor with Gladys Mitchell-Walthor of Race and the Politics of Knowledge Production, Diaspora and Black Transnational Scholarship in the US and Brazil, which was published in 2016. And her brand new book, which we will be discussing today, is called Second Class Daughters, Black Brazilian Women and Informal Adoption as Modern Slavery. So with that, we will move on to Adriana.
Hi, everyone. I'm very honored to be here. Thank you to Cecelia and to Amy for bringing Elizabeth and I together. I read Elizabeth's work when I was a graduate student, and I didn't tell this to her before the beginning of the webinar, but it's a huge honor to be able to present on my first book here today with her. So I'll just give you a very quick overview of Patchwork Freedoms. It is a book that focuses on processes of emancipation in Santiago de Cuba, Cuba's far eastern province. It is the area of the island that is known as the cradle of radicalism. It is a place where the wars of independence against Spain started in 1868, but it is also the area of the island associated with the beginnings of the 1959 Cuban Revolution. So the East has exerted an enormous amount of fascination over scholars and political activists the world over, but there have been very few histories of it that have looked at sort of local social dynamics in the long term using local archives. So the rural areas of Santiago in the 19th century were very distinct on the island. They were home to a demographically significant free and semi-free peasantry of African descent, who I argue laid a very distinctive path to emancipation in 1886. By 1886. The book makes two historiographic interventions that I'm going to focus on here. I might mention the third one if I have enough time. But the first one is that it casts light on a social geography of freedom that has received little attention to date. And the social geography of freedom goes beyond Cuba. I would argue that there are places within Latin America that are very similar to Santiago. Most histories of Cuba have focused on industrial sugar plantations, which expanded their footprint throughout the 19th century, propelling the island to the status of the largest sugar producer for the world markets by the 1820s. These were sugar plantations that relied on the steam engine and steam technology as well as on railroads. So they were extremely profitable, and they were also extremely oppressive as workspaces. They were death machines. Santiago in the east it was home to some relatively small coffee plantations and some very few and under mechanized sugar plantations. So it was marginal, economically marginal on the island compared to Havana. However, it was close enough to Havana to be subjected to the same legal framework, the same policies as the sugar regions, but it was nevertheless also far enough to escape many of the socio-racial logics that define the sugar plantation areas. So throughout the 19th century, what we see in Santiago is a demographically significant free population of color that is also expanding by the 1860s. They formed anywhere between 25 and 34% of the total population. But free people of color also formed consistently at least half of the population of African descent. So most enslaved people in the area would have known or have been related to free people of color. Moreover, 75% of the free population of African descent was rural, lived in the rural areas. We tend to associate the free populations of color around the Atlantic world and in Latin America with urban centers. But in Santiago, we see a very rural free population of color. What is also interesting is that, it's a space, given its demographics, that resonates. It's very similar to other places in Latin America that also emerged in the shadows of large and intensive extractive industries. We find similar free populations of color that are rural in places in Puerto Rico, in the Dominican Republic, Santo Domingo, in areas of Brazil and areas of Colombia, amongst others. I argue that unearthing these rural worlds of freedom sheds light on a distinct history of emancipation that is not aligned with liberalism and with liberalism trajectory. And we usually think of liberalism in relationship to white elites who were in urban centers around the major cities of the Atlantic world. But I show that the demographically significant free Afro-descendant population of Santiago emerged through manumission, a practice that received some protection in written law. Most people purchased their freedom in installments over very extended periods of time, which meant that they remained caught between slavery and full freedom. And written law did not offer insights into the status and the rights and obligations that this legally ambiguous population had. It was local community members who were asked by judges to provide insights, to weigh in and establish those rights through what was called custom, what was considered to be custom, right? Oral agreements and expectations that were locally specific. I'll go into the third contribution. So the first contribution is this different geography of freedom that is rural. The second being a sort of a history of freedom that is very local, that emerges out of local jurisdictional politics, that is not necessarily connected to large the circulation of elites around the Atlantic world, but rather through local community dynamics. And the third contribution is to the history of Cuba and to the War of Independence. The history of the war is told from the perspective of the insurgent men who were part of the military. The war started in the East. Most of the first troops were people of African descent based in the East. Some of the generals were people of color from the East, such as Antonio Maceo, Guillermo Moncada. And what my work shows is that there was a sense of political entitlement that goes back to the claims to freedom, claims to land that the peasantry of African descent had made beforehand. And many of these claims had been made by women and families. They had not just been made by men, right? So it's a history of claims making that has deeper roots that go beyond the sort of the war fields, right? That goes into the sort of local communities and households. Moreover, it's a history that shows that the first troops were committed to the ideals of the independence for with very concrete goals in mind. They wanted access to land at a time when new sugar plantations were emerging and expanding in the East. And also at a time when local judges were being prevented from relying on local custom in their decision-making process by new legal reforms, and basically that reduced the power of the local community to sort of control its territory, right? I will stop there for now, but I look forward to all the questions.
And in terms of my book, Second Class Daughters, I have to first say, Adriana, I read your book and I was completely enthralled. It was so well written, just so well done. So just congratulations on a great first book. So my book, Second Class Daughters, is really about 10 years of research, of observations and interviews with women who were informally adopted, largely Black women who were informally adopted into a wealthier, relatively wealthier families under the guise of adoption, but who live, many of whom in current day, right now, in semi-servitude or slave-like conditions in these families, these adopted families. And what I was really interested in capturing were a few things, were the intersections of race, class, gender, and emotions, right? So often researchers had studied race, class, and gender. They had focused on some of the traditional structural elements, so educational disparities, political disenfranchisement. What I wanted to do was locate one of the avenues of exploitation in captivity as the affective realm. So in investigating how informally adopted daughters have been treated and exploited, I wanted to understand what some of the affective dimensions were. So in the book, what I do is I trace some of the pathways and paths into criação. What are the push factors? What are the elements that lead to that? What are some of the risk factors for that? Then I move into questioning this idea of being as family, quasi da familia, or almost family is an idea that's typically spoken about in Brazil as it relates to these women. I wanted to provide examples of how that played out in the real life, and also recognize some of the points of contradiction, which I found was the most fascinating. So in exploring some of the contradictions, I essentially put forth this idea of affective captivity, which refers to the ways that women in my study are emotionally dependent upon or develop these affective ties almost exclusively to these families, so that even though they're being exploited, they still come to see themselves as not just being attached to, but also indebted to these families. So one of the other chapters that I deal with is it's really about the moral code of criação, with the idea that that systems of domination rely not just on structural deprivations, but also on an entire affective apparatus or an affective architecture of domination. And this moral piece is really important. So I unpacked how questions about guilt, about self-sacrifice, about long suffering, ideas that are very rooted in Christianity and religiosity, play a huge role in why and the justifications that the families use, and also become internalized by the women themselves, again, contributing to a structure where their exploitation is considered legitimate, and in some cases ideal. And so through the book, I talk about the impact of biological families in this process. In the past, there's an assumption that once the girls are move into these families, that they're completely separated from their biological families. That actually, for most of the cases, was not actually the case. And so I wanted to delve in a bit more deeply into what the role of the biological families were in the perpetuation of exploitative forms of criação. I think something that's important to say as well as I talk about this is that in the beginning of the book, I make it a point to say that I am not saying that informal arrangements in families are by definition bad. And I cite this throughout the book. Over 100 million children around the world live in informal family arrangements, and they're not necessarily based on exploitation. So this book is about the conditions under which that does happen and the practices that help undergird these type of exploitative forms of informal adoption. The last thing I'll say briefly is that in any book like this, it's important for me to recognize points of resistance. And that was really key in this book. So often when I talk to folks about the research, there's often a response that makes me feel uncomfortable. And the women in the study do not see themselves purely as victims. They see themselves as agentic. And so throughout the book, I try to point to ways that despite all of the constraints of the structural and affective world around them, they're always carving out a way to allow themselves to live in their liberty on their own terms. And so I think in that sense, Adriana, our works really resonate in terms of recognizing some forms of resistance that for many people aren't legible unless you're really looking to push the envelope and thinking differently about liberty and freedom. The last thing I'll say in terms of the book itself, and this is one of the most interesting chapters for me to write about, was that the health implications for all of this. So typically, again, sociologists tend to focus on the broader structural factors. The health of filhas de criação, or informally adopted daughters, was really important because not only did their bodies impacted negatively by this process, but their very disabilities that are created from being exploited actually leads them to remain closely tied to the families because they feel more vulnerable. They feel as though there's a risk of leaving now that they are, in some cases, disabled or have illnesses. So I say all of that to say, the whole point of this book was to analyze the structural factors that we know matter with kind of creating this matrix of domination of race, class, and gender. But for so long in the field of sociology, and in fact, even in history, we haven't really identified this affective terrain. So my intervention is really to do that and to have researchers think a bit differently about this affective architecture of domination that's just as important as the structural elements of domination. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Great, thank you. Also, I mentioned show at the beginning, these are the two gorgeous books. They're both beautiful, smart, insightful books, and they're both available in paperback. So both of your books expand the study of slavery and resistance, and then in turn, freedom, in ways that are new and very important, focusing on Afro-descended populations in Latin America. Adriana, you with Cuba and Santiago's Black population, and Elizabeth, you with African-descended informal domestic workers in Brazil. So I just wanted to ask you both to say a bit about, this is always one of my favorite questions when I'm meeting authors and talking to other books, but what led you to the research and what motivated you then to write the books that you each wrote?
So I mean, it's a bit of both personal and intellectual trajectory, and disentangling those two is very complicated, but I'll try and do it just for the sake of organizing my thoughts. But I'll start with the personal because there's a lot more serendipity in the intellectual, I think, in some ways. As perhaps one would expect, but with the personal, I grew up in socialist Romania, and I developed a very strong interest in other countries within the socialist bloc. And at the time, we all knew that socialism in Cuba had followed a very distinct trajectory, and we were fascinated. And I was very fascinated. But the amount of reading I could do around that within Romania was still, nevertheless, quite small. So throughout the 90s and 2000s, I received all kinds of fellowships to study abroad, starting with my high school education and then through my undergraduate and graduate degrees in the UK and the US. And I accumulated more readings around the topic. And I must say that the socialist background was quite something I didn't expect would matter to my colleagues in Cuba. There was a lot of recognition and solidarity in our encounters as a result of where I had grown up, and that actually helped generate a lot of very affirming intellectual exchanges that have lasted for a long time and continue to this day. Now, with the intellectual trajectory, there's a lot more serendipity there. So I started as a graduate student interested in the history of socialism and internationalist youth movements connecting Cuba and Eastern Europe. I traveled to Santiago, where I knew 1959 had started, right? And I was trying to do exploratory research. But when I got there, I started looking at the notarial records and stumbled over the 19th century notarial records in particular. And what was extremely enlightening, and it was basically a moment of epiphany, was seeing the sort of the vibrancy of the social worlds of the Black peasantry, and understanding that the claims to land that basically drove the Cuban Revolution of 1959 had these deep roots in in emancipation era and immediately post-emancipation era land claims that the Black population had made. And so this book is about the 19th century, and my next book will be about that peasantry in the 20th century. The descendants of the folk I'm writing about in this first book will be in the next book, right? As I try to understand the sort of the culture of squatting, of occupying land without title, and how that coalesced into political mobilization in the 20th century.
Well, and in my case, my interest in this topic really emerged when I was writing my first book. In fact, when I was in Salvador Bahia, Brazil, collecting research on Black families, I kept meeting women who I met who were filhas de criação. And I write about this in the introduction of my book. One day I'm renting an apartment, I'm rooming an apartment in a very nice neighborhood, and I wake up to get a glass of water, and I happen to glance into the room of the teenage son that lives there, and I see an older, elderly Black woman sleeping on his floor at his bedside. And that has literally changed the course of my trajectory. And in fact, when I saw this and started collecting other interviews with women who are filhas de criação, when I came back from the field, I told my advisor, I don't need to write The Color of Love. I need to write Second Class Daughters, because somebody has to say something. And so my advisor, I often joke about this. He said, no, you're going to finish the book that you went there to write, and your next book will be about these women who you won't stop talking about. And so in some ways, this book allows me to come full circle, beginning with the project that had nothing to do with them in particular, but had everything to do with anti-Blackness, white supremacy, and the numerous ways that families become the site for how hierarchies are reproduced. So in the first book, I'm actually writing about Black families and the ways that they sometimes internalize and also resist those hierarchies. This book allows me to turn to the elite families, which was essentially where I lived while in many cases, while I was creating or collecting data on socioeconomically disadvantaged Black families. I tended to live in these very elite neighborhoods, and I got to see a whole different side of Salvador that I knew I wanted to be able to come back to. So that's what led me to that one experience. But the sheer prevalence of me meeting so many filhas de criação without trying really said to me that this was something worth studying, and really revealing how the ordinariness of it said so much about the ordinary or the normalized aspects of domination in Brazilian society.
Thank you. So both of your books do a really incredible job of showing and sharing the human face of the history that you both tell. I wonder if you can each share a story or stories from your books that you found particularly inspiring during your research process. Elizabeth, you just told something that is exactly that kind of story, but I'm sure you have others. So would you like to start, Elizabeth?
Yeah, there are so many stories. And I mean, it's hard to actually answer that because I'm still engaged. I still talk with these women. So I think and you said inspirational. I don't know if the word is inspiring, but one of the cases that made me feel like I wanted to see this to the end was Tanya, who I've known probably the longest and who lived in these adopted family for over 40 years. Over 40 years, she's lived in this situation. And so I think being able to have these extended conversations with her and really be the first person who she'd ever said any of this to before. She'd never met anybody who had really questioned this. And so much like with my other interviewees, our conversation, our relationship was the first time that somebody had ever given them the space to talk about what they had experienced. And so watching almost all of the respondents start from saying, they treat me as though I was a family member. Almost everybody starts that way. And then once I ask them, okay, well, if you're called mom, why do you sleep on the floor behind the door? How do we make sense of this language and the contradictions that we're seeing? Why don't you get to eat at the same table and use the same dishes as the family if you're mother? And so there's so many examples of that. I think Tanya is the one that I bring up because it was such a progress, or it's a progression of thought. And at the end of the day, by the time I finished the book, actually, as I was finishing the draft, Tanya actually leaves the family. She leaves. She moves out from the family, and that was really powerful for me. And we talk even now about the impact of these conversations and her being able to understand her situation, advocate for herself, and utilize her other options that she didn't maybe think were available to resist. And so I think that's the example that comes up to me in terms of inspirational.
The example that I have is one that will bridge the boundary between the legal and the political, right? One of the things that I try to show in my work is how litigating for freedom also could have a political consequence, especially by the mid-19th century, an age of emancipation when, there are rumors about emancipation happening in other societies surrounding Cuba. And there's growing mobilization around it, claims to freedom become increasingly more vocal inside the courts. So I'll tell you the story of one woman by the name of Quintina Granda. It's a spectacular example, and I'm going to dwell a little bit on what it means to focus on something that's a bit spectacular rather than more ordinary kinds of claims. So Granda was a woman who had been born in slavery. She had 2 sons while she was still in slavery, and at one point, her owner, in whose house she had been born, became very ill and was passing away. She was taking care of him on his dying bed. He promised her her freedom as well as the freedom of her 2 sons in return for the nursing labor. The man passes away, the heirs take over the estate, and they refuse to implement the full promise. They grant Quintina Granda her freedom, but they maintain the 2 sons in slavery, and they want to send them to a sugar plantation that has just been established outside of Santiago. So the mother decides to take the heirs to the court, saying that she had been defrauded of her payments for her services, right? So she uses the language of payment for her work. Right, this was not just a compensation for her good behavior. She had a sort of monetary understanding of what she had done for the dying owner. The interesting thing about the case is the brief that the lawyer submits, in which he tells the judge that if the freedom of the 2 sons is not being implemented, it is likely that there will be more unrest amongst the population of color in Santiago on grounds that the legal system is not there to support them anymore, and people will become more restive, and the likelihood of insurgency will increase, also in light of events happening in the North, i.e. in the US, right? The year was 1864. So what I find interesting about this example is not just Quintina Granda's sense of entitlement to payment for her labor, which she had done as an enslaved woman, but also the notion that if the law doesn't help, then we will resort to extra legal measures, which was the suggestion of the lawyer and perhaps of Quintina Granda herself. And the example also that therefore points out that the distinction between legal and extra-legal measures for accessing freedom was quite blurry, and enslaved people were fully aware of it, and they were trying to push and open up legal access through the threat of extra-legal measures. I will just speak briefly, just very, very briefly about less spectacular forms of less spectacular cases, and I think they're very important. They are the ones that actually move me the most. These are notarial records, testaments filed by free people of color, men and women, who sometimes filed testaments about 12 chickens and a small house in the countryside that was not very valuable. And what I find interesting about these documents is that even though they're highly formulaic, they reveal, and even though they are about very small amounts of property, they reveal a sense of expectation that the state should protect that property. In other words, that the state was not too far away from the dirt roads of the interior, the small villages, and that the state could belong to these free men and women of color who might have been born in Africa, right, and who saw themselves as potentially as full citizens one day, right? I'll stop there.
So that brings me sort of to my next question, which you're touching on, acts of resistance and agency, et cetera. So, but can you talk a little bit about, the massive obstacles that were faced by and are faced by the populations that you study? So Elizabeth, do you want to tell us more about the system of racial, gender, and class oppression within which these adopted daughters live in?
Absolutely. So, I think one of the most obvious questions is, well, why, or at least it's a question I often get, well, why do parents send their children into criação? Why do they allow them, right? It's how people typically frame this. And I think that that's a problematic statement to begin with. But what I think people are really asking, what I hope they're asking, are what are some of what's the structural context that creates the situation where Black young women are even selected? So when we think about criação, we have to be able to think about the fact that the lowest levels the highest levels of illiteracy are within Black and brown populations. You have limited access to jobs, very low political representation. You have this difference between rural and urban life, which actually plays a huge role in the women who I research now. And when we think about some of the pathways into this, the Black women who are in my study are facing several types of forms of trauma, violence, abuse, in addition to not being able to have access to schools that would presumably give them access. And in fact, one of the promises that these wealthier families make is that the transfer of these children into their families will provide a better opportunity. That's always the language, a better opportunity. And what we see happen is that often doesn't necessarily translate. Sometimes the women move into these families and they still don't have access to school, or they get to stay in school just long enough to be able to write their names, and that's it. So we think about an entire structure where there are deprivations at the structural level. There are also these ideological and stereotypes that are also functioning that really ascribe Black women's identity to that of worker, underpaid worker. And then in addition to that, if we think about domestic worker more broadly, and maybe we'll have a chance to talk about this later on, there's a whole understanding that it's Black women's roles to serve as domestic workers. And that role is also connected to the idea that Black mothers have been the mothers of the nation, the mais pretas, or the Black nannies or Black mammies, really, of the nation. So all of that comes together to create the structural context, the ideological context, and this kind of moral context where because Black women in some cases don't have access to other forms of reputation or capital, their moral capital becomes really important here, which is also a consideration in terms of why they end up staying. There have been a number of achievements in Brazil. This is a 10-year project. So I went to seeing Brazil as the sleeping giant that's awakened to also now being led by a leader who's far right, who's rolled back a lot of the social programs related to poverty, education, affirmative action. And so the benefits of having this 10-year long project is that I've been able to see the ebbs and flows and how they've impacted the women in this study. The last thing I'll say is that, I'll save this for later on, but I think that all of these, the uncertainties are partially why you see families giving their children away. And the context of so much uncertainty, especially connected to Blackness, and then layered on these kind of gendered identities, you see why families are hopeful that by giving their children away, they might be able to forge a better life for them. And unfortunately, that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, so absolutely. So the book is not, one thing I want to point out is that the book is not arguing that the law works for people of African descent straightforwardly, right? So there's a question in the chat. Hi, Fidel. I saw your question, Fidel Tavares. I'm a big fan of your work, and I'll answer it in my answer right here. There was an argument made back in, I think, 1946 by Frank Tannenbaum, right? That there are certain openings in the written law within the Spanish Empire, openings for manumission, openings for marriage for enslaved people through the Catholic Church, that allowed more access to freedom. And the book shows actually the positioning of the legal framework within a larger political economy. The possibility of using the law really depended on where you were within Latin America, right, and within Cuba. We don't see the same kinds of legal records in places such as Matanzas or Trinidad or Cardenas, right? Areas where you have the massive sugar system in place, right? So this was a very racist society. It was dominated by a legal system that was there to prop up the plantation. And the population of African descent of Santiago had to fight against that. Moreover, there had been policing measures that were put in place after an 1844 conspiracy against slavery that had occurred in Matanzas. These policing measures were supposed to clamp down on the rights of the free population of color across the island. However, what is very interesting and understudied about Santiago is that in spite of these measures, the size and wealth of the free population of color in the area of Santiago increased after 1844. This is another reason why I was particularly fascinated by this population. How did they manage to emerge, right, to push back against these highly oppressive measures that were in place? And so the book shows that, it's about the political economy that basically reduced the power of the elite. The elites were very fragmented. They didn't have the policing resources to control the population of African descent, free and enslaved, into the rural areas. The geography, it was very mountainous and rugged territory. It was very forested. There was also an access to cash crops that were increasing in value, right? Tobacco. The value of tobacco on global markets went up, and peasants from Santiago were producing a lot of tobacco, and that helped them buy their relatives out of plantation slavery in some cases, right? So I'll stop there, but I think that my work is trying to show the sort of the political, economic, and policing and sort of criminal law pressures on the population of African descent, whilst also looking at the sort of dynamic ways in which people were making law on the ground and expanding what was available to them through the written legal framework.
Thank you. So we're getting some questions in the chat, so I want to turn to a couple of those now. This one I think is for you, Elizabeth. As a researcher, how do you see your role in affecting change in these situations where the women are exploited? Or how much do you refrain from getting involved? What did you have to be aware of during your research and writing process in terms of content and what to include and exclude? And finally, the third part of the question, what kind of lessons are you able to extract that apply to experiences here in the US?
Wow, that's a three-parter. I'm going to answer the best I can. Number one, I think the question was this question of intervention. The very fact that I was asking questions meant I was changing their lives. And that's not usually what we go out and do. That's not usually what sociologists do. But early on, I realized, and they would tell me themselves, they would come back after a couple of years and say, we had this conversation about this. I just want you to know that it might seem like a small thing, but I've started to ask for payment for this work that I'm doing, or I've started to not let somebody talk to me in a certain way. So part of what I see from your question is how did I navigate that? And I think as a researcher, I had to be very cautious to ask the right question, but not tell folks what to do. It wasn't for me to say, you need to leave and, pack your bags now, this is horrible. Even though sometimes I felt like I wanted to say that would have been completely inappropriate. And what was actually most helpful is to create the space for these women to think through questions that they had never been asked to stop and think through, and let them come to the decision about what that looked like. And so that sometimes meant me being silent as women. For example, there's one case of Maisa where she would talk about her exploitation. In the entire interview, she's smiling the entire time. and I feel myself getting angry. I am angry at what's happening to her, but there was a level of emotional incongruency. And so I needed to temper that, to hear what she had to say and understand what is it that's leading to this mismatch. And if we're mismatching emotionally, there's something that I need to be listening to make sure I'm capturing. So I constantly had to check myself to be sure I was doing that. There was a second question. I'm going to skip that because I don't remember what the second part was, but I'll go to the third question, which is, what is the broader lesson? And this is not going to bring in your book, Adriana, because I think that the broader lesson here is maybe not. I read your book, Adriana. I've really been kind of struggling with some of these ideas because I think the broader lesson is this. One of the most powerful forms of domination is being able to give people crumbs and make them feel good about it. And in so many ways, I feel like the elites in your book, Adriana, were really, they were never, you write this, they were never threatened by manumission. They weren't threatened because they had other forms of dominating these folks. And so in the case in Brazil, you have a situation where where families can engage in some of these oppressive behaviors because they always had this fail-safe, which is that they have deprived these women of other affective attachments. So in many cases, the women didn't even have places to go to when they wanted to leave. So I think I've been kind of struggling with making sense of how this functions now in the US and across the world in terms of negotiating power and ways in which certain groups are given small evidence or small spaces for progress, as long as it doesn't threaten the status quo and as long as it doesn't threaten the dominant hierarchies. And I think the question is, how do we continue to leverage in a collective way our efforts so that we can in fact dismantle the hierarchies rather than negotiate within them? And I think that's the constant struggle. And how do we do that without discounting the real ways that people on the ground kind of have to use what they have to get what they want? So I don't know if that answers this question, but this is how, Adriana, your book has gotten me thinking about these broader questions.
Okay, so I'm going to take some more questions in the chat. This one for you, Adriana. Could you elaborate a bit on the novel part of your book, which is also taking into account African patterns of wealth in people holding in 19th century Cuba?
Yes, so one of the things that I do in my book is think about the role of social relations in processes of manumission and litigation, right? And in looking at these broader social networks which people emerge into freedom, we can think of manumission as something more than just an individual process of upward mobility. There are other people involved in it, and news and information about how the workings of it spread. Now, in one of the things that we see in Santiago is hierarchies within the community of African descent that develop through manumission, right? And some of the sort of clientelar networks that are not so how should I call them? Not very hierarchical. They're somewhat hierarchical, but they're not as hierarchical as they would be if we had a very extensive number of, say, white enslavers and planters in particular being involved in them. So I was very interested in these sort of less sharp hierarchies and lateral relations. Scholars of Africa have called them wealthy people, right? So, people of African descent who, some of them even enslaved, who might own other people who are themselves enslaved, right? So pretty complex way of organizing relations that goes against, the sort of commonly held assumptions about slavery and freedom. But I think that they're not necessarily just specific to Africa, right? And they're not necessarily from Africa. It's hard to prove, that it was only African people within Santiago who were building these hierarchies, right? We see many women, some of them born within Cuba, people of African descent, right, who become, through god parentage, they expand their social retinues, and those god parentage networks are for instance, ways of helping people emerge out of slavery, whilst also perpetuating, as Elizabeth's work shows, relations of dependency, right, in the very long term. And some of those dependents end up suing those godparents, right? There are cases that appear in the courts about that. And so I think, maybe they are of African origins, but they could also be clientelar networks that had developed within Cuba. And I think what I also find interesting about them is that, to quote actually Michelle McKinley's work, Michelle asked this question. They show, they force us, situations like this force us to think about manumission with reference to the ripples that they create in the system, right? There are these social networking devices that go quite far and wide beyond the individual undergoing the manumission process. And that forces us to go beyond an approach to manumission that thinks about rates, manumission as rates of manumission, right? The number of people, but rather as process, right? And when we see it as process, then we can also think of its political implications, right? It's not just a social phenomenon, it's also a political process that might culminate in social mobilization, which is something that I argue happens by the 1860s.
I just want to talk a little bit. So there are similarities between your two books, but I also am wondering about the ways that your findings may contradict. So can you talk about the points of connection that you see, but also how there are differences in the histories that you're both telling? Elizabeth, would you like to start?
I like this question. I've really been thinking about your book quite a bit, Adriana, and I think that there are more commonalities than differences. But one of the interesting parts of your book that resonated with me is the way that notions of debt and reciprocity were often used in order to make an argument for freedom, right? And in my book, they're used in a very different type of way, that debt and reciprocity are in fact why women are held captive, right? This idea is that they owe these families, that they should be grateful, they should not leave, that they are indebted for their entire lives was used as a rationale for them staying. And so I just think that that's just a different usage of debt and reciprocity. So as I read that in your book, I thought, wow, there's another way that this could be done to make the opposite case. The other thing I liked about your book is the affective part of it. So I wasn't expecting to find this in your book, but I really love the examples of where folks are using their affective attachments to the slave holder as evidence or as evidence to support their claims for freedom. And so whereas again in my book, these affective ties are often used as a way to kind of ensnare women in a type of kind of specific power relations. In your book, we see affective ties being mobilized by oppressed groups in very different ways. So I thought that's got in my mind working a bit in terms of points of similarity and difference. I have a kind of a list of things here that I wanted to talk to you about, but you mentioned this idea of how kinship and godparentage is also used, and that's something that we both kind of grapple with, and we both also recognize the ways that they can be beneficial, right, to expand the family network, but also negative if they're used for exploitation. And I think in that sense, we see how it's important to not discount these informal familial arrangements, because just like you've said, and just like my work shows, these arrangements have been some of the only arrangements that enslaved people had. And even post-abolition, folks had to really find some semblance of mobility. So thinking through how we can recognize that and recognize what might be best described as these degrees of freedom, rather kind of freedom versus captive, is really helpful. I'll stop there now for you to chime in, Adriana.
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, I think this was just so beautifully done. I don't know if I have anything to add. I just also think like we work on different time periods and different spaces, so I think, I work in a time when the sort of the vocality, the loudness of the claims, the political claims to emancipation is so widespread in that area that it's sort of hard to get away from it within the archive. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that too, if we're going to talk about archives at all. And the other thing I was going to say, we talked earlier a little bit about when you have elites giving away crumbs as a way of co-opting a small group of the population that is oppressed as a way of controlling everyone else, like a pressure release system, right? Manumission being one of those pressure release systems. And I think that and there are many discussions about that in the historiography, and also in sociologists have also done, have discussed this with reference to manumission within Latin America. And one thing that I found myself as I was researching was getting away from like a certain theory of manumission and seeing that actually elites might be thinking they're going to do something, and then it happened that in this particular context, actually their powers were so attacked, right, by so many different things: the economy, the global economy in some situations, hurricanes, the environment, the mountains, a population of African descent that understood territory better than them sometimes. For me, I thought that was the sort of the expectations that I had of manumission were being challenged by the archives, and what I thought elites could do was not exactly what they were doing actually when I saw the documents. But I stopped there. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. You also have this idea, if I may, Cecelia.
Of course.
I really enjoyed your discussion of prudential politics. And the reason why I'm so drawn to your book, Adriana, if I'm honest, is because of its relevance today in the United States. So you all heard of all these administrative roles that I have right now. I'm at this point where you have an administration, there's some demands about what anti-racism looks like, what addressing systemic racism looks like. And it's been interesting to watch how administrations make decisions about what concessions are made, what's not made, and why, and how some of the same strategies that we see back in the 18th century, 19th century, 20th century, whether we're talking about Brazil or Cuba for that matter, there's almost this kind of playbook of domination, playbook of what it takes to be exploitative. And I think I've really been thinking through what that means in my own profession in a way that I just didn't expect your book to initiate. So I'm just grateful to have these examples of the ways that laws and custom can both be part of this broader process. Just really great work.
Okay, I'm going to jump in with another question from the chat. Elizabeth, this is for you. This attendee says, I'm curious about the life cycle of servitude of the subjects of your book. In the historical record, I see a lot of gifts of Black children as companions and playmates to Spanish children in the 16th and 17th century. I know that African children are circulated as gifts among elite families. I wondered if there was continuity in this in the 20th century.
That's a really great question. I think there are two examples that come up, and one of them is a woman by the name of Madrina, a woman who's called godmother, and she actually dies before I get a chance to interview her. But she's lived in this family for generations, and in fact, as you suggested, as family members died, she was gifted to certain families, or they wouldn't have described it as gifting. There'd be a debate about who would take Madrina, right? Whose house would she live in? And so we certainly see the type of the way that you see patrimony passed down from generation to generation. I think Madrina's passage through these different generations really reflected parts of that. There's also an example of a young woman by the name of Angela who ends up sleeping over one night for a birthday party with the white child of the family that her mother is a domestic worker in. And the young white girl tells her family, let's adopt her. I really have a lot of fun with her. Can we just adopt her? And so in the same way that you have Black children adopted to be a nanny, a playmate with children, that example really resonated with that very same idea of how Black children are seen as things for entertainment. And in fact, I didn't include this in the book. When I would talk to Black Brazilians about this research, so often they would tell me about how when they were younger, white families unsolicited would come up to their mothers and say, I'd love to adopt your child. I mean, there's no reason for them to do this, but they would see them in the market and kind of say, oh, that's a cute kid. I would love to adopt them. So the very association with Black children as these kind of objects of entertainment that could be exchanged was very much present in my research in Brazil in the 21st century. So when we talk about continuity, that's still present now.
Okay, now it's a question for you, Adriana. I wanted to know if you came across any influences from within and outside Cuba shaping the ways that the elites in Santiago de Cuba and enslaved Afro-Cubans managed manumission and labor. I'm thinking about the western parts of Cuba for the elites in the east and for Haiti and or Santo Domingo for enslaved Afro-Cubans.
So Eastern Cuba sees the arrival of a large wave of refugees from Saint Domingue mostly between 1803 and until 1808, when the majority of them depart for New Orleans. Some of them arrive even earlier, around 1793, and some of them also return from New Orleans around 1815, 1816, when they start a new coffee boom in the region. So there are connections, right? And there is movement. We know that there is some movement between Jamaica. There's some contraband trade between Jamaica, Santiago, Saint Domingue that has been documented. But I think the interesting thing that I do in the book is to explore how even though there are rumors about events happening in Saint Domingue or emancipation happening in Jamaica, what we see inside the courts and in the notarial offices is a population of African descent that's using that as a threat, again, to prompt prudential policies, right? To generate more of what they know works locally. So rather than say we want to be free because the folk in Saint Domingue are free, they're saying some of them, not all of them, obviously, they seem to be saying we want to get more rights gradually because we know this is happening in Saint Domingue and you probably don't want that to happen here as well, right? Which is a much less risky approach, right, than insurgency or threat of insurgency across the board. So regarding the policies of the elites, what the elites are doing, I think that the elites are doing one thing, for instance, on plantations in Santiago, they rely on, and this relates to Elizabeth's work, they rely on godparentage networks amongst the enslaved. They encourage godparentage. This is something that Stuart Schwartz has also written about in Brazil, and I see Stuart is amongst our attendees. Hello, Professor Schwartz. I'm a huge fan of your work, has been formative of mine. So thank you for being here, for making time. But they rely on godparentage relations amongst the enslaved in order to control them. However, by the 1830s, as some of the people within these networks become free, those same networks become an accelerator for manumission, right? So again, there's the unexpected happening, right? That and godparentage is used within, so enslaved people who had been born on plantations are encouraged to serve as godparents for those who are being brought from Africa, newly arrived from Africa, or for some children born on the plantation, as a way of creating hierarchies amongst. So godparentage is not as a nice, familial community, but rather godparentage is a tool for creating hierarchies amongst the workers. Right. However, by the 1830s, godparents are expected to provide resources if they're free for those who they serve as godparents to who are held in slavery. And that's why some free people of color say, I don't want to be a godparent because there will be an expectation that I will provide a down payment for freedom. Right. But many do provide that down payment.
If I could just, I want to say something about godparentage, because what's interesting about that is there's a power dynamic here, right? So the godparents still have the decision. They get to choose whether and how they give. I write about this in the book, where there's a statement that may God will pay you back if you do a favor and expect something in return. If you're a lower status person, then you hope that the person pays you back, but they may not. But lower status people actually are much more likely to pay things back because there's a higher onus on them. But I love this example of thinking about the different ways that godparentage has been used and perhaps even abused to both manipulate, to both reinforce hierarchies and to also resist them, which I think is really at the crux of our works, is kind of navigating that tension there.
Okay, so we're just about out of time, but I want to squeeze in this one last question for you, Elizabeth. Relative to cases such as that of Tanya, what sorts of paths does/can emancipation for adopted daughters lead to? Example, in Tanya's case, leaving the family. Is there long-term evidence for the trajectories of these individuals relative to post-emancipation quality of life, lifestyles, etc.?
Okay, long-term evidence. Well, let me say this. Folks have not studied filhas de criação. One of the contributions of this book is that finally we are giving light to the fact that these women even exist in the first place. And I have to say hello, because I think Mary Romero is here, a luminary in sociology. So we're giving shout outs. I have to say hi to Mary. So hi, Mary. So I think when we think about long-term evidence, we don't quite have that yet. I mean, I think one of the opportunities is to, in fact, follow what happens. But similar to what Adriana shows, and this is where it gets interesting, even when these women leave, they don't actually leave. Many of them still retain connections to these adoptive families. So I mentioned someone named Angela, who actually moves out of the family, but she's expected to pay back a debt for the rest of her life. So even thinking through what these trajectories look like is important. So it's not really free versus captive. It's what are the conditions of freedom? What does that look like? And how, even within that context, these women are still negotiating what freedom looks like. So in Angela's case, she's expected to go back and care for the white family that's adopted her, but she also makes these very intentional decisions about how to keep physical distance from them so she's less likely to be asked to do things, right? So this is one of her ways of resisting, of creating boundaries within her capacity here. So I think there's a lot more work to be done. I hope that other folks take this topic on and think about informal adoption, not just in Brazil, but across Latin America, where you have forms of criadasco that look very similar to this, or we have Restivex in Haiti. So I consider this book what I hope will be an entry point for other researchers to continue this work.
Thank you both so much for doing this. I knew it would be great to have you two together, and it really was. Thank you all for joining us. And we will hope to see you again at another Cambridge University Press webinar in the future. Bye-bye.
Thank you, folks. Bye.
Thank you.